Okay, go. What's up, Spanish Springs? Welcome to Unit 4, Lecture 1, Congress. All right, get out of here. All right, y'all, I got 19 minutes on the camera, so here we go. Thanks, you guys. Bye. All right, so Congress. All right, so this is Lecture Notes 1 and 2, right? Unit 4, Lecture 1. All right, so we're talking about Congress, the legislative branch, Article 1 of the Constitution, okay? So we got to go back to the framers a little bit. And remember, the framers are always, always concerned with power. And concentration of power, particularly because they believe that a concentration of power in any one political unit could lead to the potential or tyranny, right? So they have a couple fears. They're afraid of excessive power in a single institution. By institutions, which we begin right now, Unit 4, which is the institutions unit. Congress, the President, the bureaucracy, and the courts. So in any institution, they're afraid of excessive power. So one of the things they do with the legislative branch is they create a bicameral legislature, right? We have a House and we have a Senate. So that takes the legislative power, but instead of one institution, they divide it among the House and among the Senate. And then as you're going to see as this unit goes on, the House and the Senate have very different characteristics. Again, showing that the framers fear of tyranny. All right? And so the other fear they have is mob rule by an impassioned majority. And again, a passionate majority, impulsive majority. Right? And so what they do there is, again, we have this kind of upper and lower house. The House of Representatives is supposed to be kind of a link to the masses, right? They're elected every 2 years. There's more of them. They're in congressional districts rather than whole states. All right? And then what they did is they created a lower house with the House of Representatives. And I don't think lower is probably the right term, but it's definitely more linked to the masses. Because when the Constitution was written, you and I directly elected the House members, all right? But then they created the Senate, and the Senate, though, was chosen by, the Senate is considered the upper house. They serve longer terms, there's fewer of them, they represent an entire state, right? And they were also, originally as the Constitution was written, chosen by the state legislatures, all right? The legislative body at a state would choose the 2 senators for that state, all right? And so there was the idea is there's a little bit of a filter to choose the senators, so they would be the upper house, the more elite. And you're going to see the characteristics as we move on, okay? Now also representation in Congress was another concern. How do they devise this to make it fair to the states that existed coming from the Articles of Confederation? And so what they do is, again, create a bicameral legislature, right? And the idea is, this is the great compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. A Senate based on equal representation that appeased the small states, and then a House based on population, which appeased the larger states, all right? Okay. Now, the other thing is, the framers believed that the Congress would be the dominant branch of government. Now, but what we mean in dominant doesn't mean tyrannical, doesn't mean oppressive, doesn't mean that the other branches wouldn't be able to check them or have some voice. They just thought that in a Republican system, the representative branch, the legislative branch, would be the most important in a democratic Republican society. All right? Now we get into power here, all right? And you have this basic contest again, right? Centralization and decentralization, right? This idea of, is power spread out or decentralized within Congress itself, or is power centralized within Congress itself? Before we talked about centralization and decentralization in the states, in federalism, right? But now we're talking about, okay, we have a House and we have a Senate. All right, and then if power is centralized, what does that mean? If power is decentralized, what does that mean? Now, it seems like inherently that you should kind of think, if power is centralized, that means fewer people are making decisions. And if fewer people are making decisions over the rank and file members of that chamber, things are going to be done quickly, things are going to be done efficiently, right? But if power is decentralized, spread out among the leadership, but also the rank and file, then things are going to be stalled, things are going to go much slower. Right? Now think about the benefits of centralization. Things are quick, things are efficient, things get done. However, there's the potential for tyranny. You think about decentralization, right? Things are slow, right? things aren't going to get done quickly. They're going to be chaotic. They could be messy. However, we avoid that kind of potential for one group of people to be tyrannical over another. And the other sense, some people could argue, is this decentralization of power among the members of Congress, the House and the Senate, would lead to a more democratic view, meaning their local interests are going to get represented through them if they have power. All right? So, let's think about this. Now look at centralization versus decentralization. All right? Things are quickly and decisively done. However, members of Congress themselves, the rank and file, don't get their views out or their constituents' views out. All right? Decentralization, what you have is the individual members have power. Their constituents' voices may be heard more loudly, but it's not, things aren't going to get done. All right? And you have to kind of think, you know, what would the framers desire? I mean, I would guess more than likely the framers, it's the Goldilocks effect. You want our government to be efficient when we need it to be efficient and quick. But you want to make sure at the same time that we have a voice for all the pluralistic views that exist within our society. I know a lot of people are probably frustrated. Like, let's think about the government shutdown. You know, you had, in some sense, a faction within the Republican Party who disagreed with the Affordable Care Act, with Obamacare, and they had the ability to slow government down and get their opinion out there. I think like some people are going to be frustrated by that, but in the same sense, you also have to think it in the view of a democratic society allowing the voice of the minority to get out. Right now, you know, somebody could argue too that it was passed, that legislation was passed by a majority vote in a House and a Senate, and therefore a majority spoke at that moment. However, remember, we're majority rule with minority rights, all right? Okay, so remember that leadership is the Speaker of the House, the majority leaders, the chair members. One of the things, you guys, that it talks about committee interference. You're going to learn committees on another day, all right? But committees are really the work engines, the workhorse of Congress. They divide their labor into numerous committees, standing committees, that work on specific issues. They hold hearings, they write legislation, they conduct oversight over the executive branch, meaning they watch the executive branch carry out law, and they divide the labor into areas of expertise. Usually members of Congress are on committees that best reflect their constituents' interests. All right, so let's do this. Mark Amaday is the representative for this our congressional district, the 2nd Congressional District. All right, we live in the 2nd Congressional District. Extra credit. Find out the committees that Mark Amaday is on. All right, all right. So these committees divide labor, and then if you have a lot of power decentralized into all the committees, then that's going to slow things down. But if you only allow those committees to be controlled by the leadership, the speakers, the majority leaders, etc., that'll centralize power and allow it to be efficient. All right? Now, we've seen Congress essentially, when the House was created, power was centralized, and we've seen this kind of decentralization over the existence of the institution itself, all right? Particularly in the 1970s, all right? We see this kind of increase in the number of staffers. We see an increase in the number of subcommittee chairmen, right? We see the individual member in the 70s gaining power through a couple different ways, and you can look at that and see, okay? All right. But make sure you understand this basic idea of centralization versus decentralization, and then we apply it to the House and to the Senate. All right? Now, generally what we're going to say is the House is a much more centralized body. There are 435 members. So it seems like maybe your natural instinct would be to say... Seems like your natural instinct would be, well, since there's so many people, power is more decentralized. But what you're going to find is the House, because there's so many people, there's much more rigid rules on how things are done. And so power is definitely, there's a lot of power up at the leadership in the House so they can get things done, so they can control that large group of people. All right? Okay. Now, if we compare that to the Senate is definitely a much more decentralized or informal body, right? There's fewer people, there's fewer rules, so power is spread out among those fewer people, all right? There's not a speaker which has absolute control, all right? The House has a speaker of the House who's very, very, very powerful within that legislative chamber, right? But the Senate has a majority leader, but the individual members in the Senate are incredibly powerful, and you're going to see why in a few minutes, all right? Also, the Senate doesn't have a strong rules committee, all right? And we're also just planting a seed, all right? Just trust me that a lot of this is going to make sense as we go along, all right? The Rules Committee in the House basically says when debates can happen, how long these debates can happen, the rules under the debate, when the debates will happen, like can you add amendments, can you not add amendments, that kind of thing. It's also going to schedule the time of the debates, right? So the Rules Committee is incredibly powerful in the House, but there really isn't a strong Rules Committee in the Senate. Legislation can get to the floor where there can be votes and there can be debate in the Senate much more easily than it can in the House because of the rigid formal rules that exist within the House. All right, now, the Senate also, the 17th Amendment called for the direct election of senators. Remember, when the Constitution was written, we voted for House members, but we did not vote for senators directly. That was done by the state legislatures. Now this is done by the 17th Amendment, which says you and I get to directly elect our U.S. senators, all right? One of the other reasons that the House, or the Senate is much more decentralized than the House is a couple things, all right? Two things. The filibuster. The filibuster is essentially a rule within the Senate that allows unlimited debate. All right, now think about that. If there's going to be a vote on a piece of legislation, but one member or a handful of members can impose a filibuster, which is a stalling tactic. Now, it was intended to make sure that the voice of the minority was heard, that the voices of all 100 members of the Senate could be brought to the floor for debate. All right, it's used a lot of times nowadays by both D's and R's as a political tactic to stall. All right, from legislation happening. They say if filibuster is on, you can't vote on this legislation. All right. Now the way you end up, and so what that does is that decentralizes power. It gives individual members the ability to kind of stop the U.S. Senate from moving forward with a filibuster. All right. Also, a filibuster can be ended with a 3/5 vote of cloture. And I always think of cloture as closure to a filibuster. All right. And what that means is 3/5 of 100 members of the Senate vote for cloture, and the filibuster is ended. If we look at the numbers right now in the Senate, you have a 52-48 majority for the Democrats. If the Republicans want to filibuster something, they can. The Democrats don't have 60 votes needed for a 3/5 cloture. They need to steal 8 Republicans to come over and vote for cloture. But again, remember our party unity scores. That doesn't happen very often in the Senate. All right? Okay. Now, let's think about just Congress in general for a minute, all right? And go down to this concept in number 6 on page 2, right, of holds. All right, this is what a hold is. If a single U.S. senator says, I put a hold on that law, that legislation, nothing can go forward on that legislation. A senator can also put a hold on a nomination for the courts, for the U.S. ambassador, etc. All right, they can put a hold on that. And so what that does is that decentralizes power because an individual member can say, I place a hold on that. And it was initially designed, the hold, again, so that a member could say, I need more time to vote, right? I need more time to get informed before I make my vote. But what's been done again and again is these are now actually used politically to stall, the agenda of certain presidents, all right? The D's use them to get a Republican president, their policies stopped, and the R's use it against the Democratic presidents, right? But again, you can say it's the voice of the minority as well being reflected in our government. All right, now again, filibusters. Filibusters, again, used to be for debate in the sense that we want the American people, we want more debate to be heard from the U.S. Senate on this important issue. All right, lots of times these are simply used now as stalling tactics or political tactics rather than actually to change people's minds. All right, but again, if you're not filibustering something, you probably think it's frustrating. But if you are filibustering something, you probably think it's incredibly important. All right? Okay. So, let's just step back for a second. All right? Let's think about this. All right? Really quickly, just a few minutes. Article 1 is the legislative branch. The legislative branch's job is to write legislation, right? We have the separation of powers in our system to avoid tyranny. We have 2 chambers within our legislative branch, the House and the Senate. All right, there's 100 senators, there's 435 House members. All right, these people are elected at the federal level to write federal legislation that impacts the country. All right, now remember that members of the House represent a congressional district. Members of the Senate represent an entire state. All right? It's Article 1. All right, we looked at, now think about this. What I would love for you guys to do is go back to the Unit 1 now and look at some of these things. Look at the enumerated powers of Congress, right? What are those enumerated powers? That links to this legislative branch. What are the implied powers? That links back to this legislative branch. Go back and look at the checks and balances from Unit 1 so you can see those now come into play in this Unit 4 when we're talking about Congress. And again, when I say Congress, I generally mean the House and the Senate. All right? When I say how many members are in Congress, that's 535, right? Which is different than how many electoral votes, which is 538, because we have to count the 3 people from D.C. Okay? So, go find out Mark Amadei's committees. All right? That'll be good. That'll be extra credit. All right? You should be on a handful of committees, and there'll be committees and subcommittees, all right? And all a subcommittee is it just kind of divides the labor even more. You can have the House Committee on Agriculture, but then the subcommittees of the House Committee on Agriculture deal with issues like, farming in particular, livestock in particular, how to store and house food and things like that from the Agriculture Committee, right? They divide the labor, all right? And again, this idea of centralization and decentralization. If we have a centralized Congress, that means things are done quickly and efficiently, right? But at the expense of maybe the pluralistic nature of our country. If we have a decentralized system, and again, how do you make it centralized or decentralized? Do you make rules that allow those things to exist? Right? If we have a decentralized system, it's not very efficient, but it does let the voices of all the views within our society kind of come out. Right? And again, think about this previous government shutdown that we had, right? We had a House controlled by the Republicans, we had a chamber controlled by the Democrats, right, in the Senate, and they had conflicting views on legislation and funding and budgets. Even though that was frustrating, what that did is they didn't put that power into the hands of one group of people. They divided that power, right? So they could have conflict, because a lot of times we have to understand is conflict forces debate, right? Debate forces compromise, right? And the idea is a democratically elected body is going to have to reflect the multiple views that exist within our society, okay? All right. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.